Hey everyone, my name is Lou, and it's time to continue work on Privateer, the sci-fi first-person shooter I've been working on. Also, I've got a new mic, so hopefully I sound better than usual. Let's jump straight in. The very first refactor I ever did in this project was to break up our single large player script into multiple scripts which work together. This resulted in 14 different scripts for different behaviors, the majority of which were attached to the player and had various mono-behavior specific functions like update, which get called every single frame. Each one also had dependencies that needed setup at start to be sure they all had references to each other, the main state machine, and our active player input. The very first task I did this month was to essentially rebuild the entirety of the player controller to simplify this. To do this, I created a new state machine, one that uses pure C# classes and a state factory to reduce the amount of code running at any one time. Now there are only 4 scripts attached to the player, and I did my best to make most of the logic event-driven rather than being handled in update. The dependency injection at startup was completely removed as well. The main reason I had it at all was to subscribe functions to specific input events. However, it turns out there's a component for that which allows you to call any public method using Unity events. After attaching that component and setting the events up, there was no need to do any startup code. Everything could just be handled directly in the inspector. While I was reworking everything, I significantly redid the movement code, specifically removing the hard upper limit we were setting on the player's velocity. Instead, I started using drag to approximately set a speed limit. The player moves with a certain force, and that has a slightly weaker force pointing in the opposite direction, which will eventually reach an equilibrium to keep them from infinitely accelerating. I couldn't use normal rigid body drag, however, as that works in all directions and made it so the player was very floaty when they jumped or fell off a ledge. As a result, I had to create my own drag function that works only in a horizontal plane while keeping vertical motion the same. It's not perfect, but it works well enough for now. With this implemented, external forces can now properly influence the player's movement. To keep from launching myself into oblivion, I created this fully enclosed map as well as a few prompts that will launch rigid bodies that enter them, which I'm calling mass drivers. They come in a few styles. There are 2 that look similar to ramps that will launch you at either a 30-degree or 45-degree angle, or there are ones which look more like pads that act more as an elevator with a constant force. In all cases, the force is variable, so I can dial in the exact arc I'd like for short hops or long jumps. The second area I reworked were the weapons. As mentioned in the previous devlog, I liked the direction we were going, but found it difficult to maintain due to my subpar animating skills. As such, I reverted to a more typical style of shooting from the player's camera. I outright removed our procedural recoil, reticle, and so on because they were designed for the more complicated way of shooting, and without it were pretty much useless. Also, with the more physics-driven motion, I think this is the right direction to go in because I can't imagine trying to aim with the old system while flying through the air. Part of this rework included adding new reticles for each weapon, as well as setting up flashing messages for when the player is out of ammo or consumables. This new player HUD is a continuation of my experimentation with UI Toolkit. The more I learn, the simpler I'm finding it to work with for the most part, so long as there's documentation for the specific feature I'm trying to work with. While I was at it, I reworked the list views which previously gave me trouble. After figuring out how to properly set up the make item function, I was able to add sprites to each item for visual representation. This said, I'm still not quite sure how to format the alternating rows so they don't appear white. Looking at the class, I can see there's a static property to set that style, but not how to set it for a specific instance. Trying to move past it for now, I got the item database set up with sprites as well, and then I decided to attempt setting up the search bar whose documentation is as clear as mud in my opinion. I couldn't find how to specify a list or array to query, and it didn't look like there were any callbacks, so I'd need to figure out how to make them myself. As such, those are in the to-do eventually pile. One of the tasks I was happier to accomplish was finally sorting out character animations. I teased this at the end of the previous devlog, but didn't make a full section dedicated to it because I honestly hadn't anticipated it to work. Essentially, my issue during my first attempts were animations causing interference with each other, which is what led to all the wobbling. Forward kinematics made it so motion in the player's hips was influencing every bone further up the spine. Having no motion to counteract this, due to being masked off, is what was causing my problems. When I went to make my own walking animations, I decided to give certain bones specific jobs. The run cycle was primarily handled by the hips and all the bones in the legs. However, I did assign the topmost spine bone the important job of providing counter rotation, which is what I was previously lacking to keep everything straightened up. The middle 2 spine bones are what's responsible for torso twist to allow looking side to side without rotating the legs. The arms, neck, and head are then used to aim up and down. I also created a crouching idle pose and walk animations. It's not perfect and will require additional work, but for now this allows me to actually walk around and show you things rather than standing in place while I talk. One area I didn't get as much done in was the inventory. Like the player controller, I wanted to do a full teardown and rebuild. It wasn't entirely fruitless though. I did manage to get 2 important functionalities set up. The first being item stacking. I eventually caved in and decided to implement bullet items since they're the main reason I need this functionality. While most weapons take magazines, One weapon I've not fully reworked yet is the shotgun. Its method of reloading hinges on single loading individual shells, as you do with most shotguns. However, without item stacking, one shell per slot is a very quick way to fill up your inventory. I still haven't redone the shotgun yet, but I did go ahead and start setting up interactions between items in your inventory. In this case, allowing you to reload empty magazines if you have the correct kind of bullets to go in them. Right now, this is very explicitly only for putting bullets into a magazine, but on the docket for next time is to make this system more generic to allow for weapon or armor attachments, or directly loading a magazine into your weapon in your inventory instead of having to equip it and do the full animation. I did intend to do more for this devlog, but the past 2 months have been a roller coaster for my family, and so I've had to do a lot of helping out. If I wasn't doing this full time, this probably would have been one of those situations where I put the project down and just never pick it back up. This month has been a lot of stop and go, and it's hard to get into a flow of working most of the time. Now that the dust has settled for the most part, I can get back to work pretty confidently. Next devlog will focus on a handful of tasks. As mentioned, I want to formalize the setup of the drag and drop interactions in the player's inventory, as well as re-implement the shotgun. After that, I want to finally implement health, death, and respawning, which should be fairly straightforward now that I have a character to attach hitboxes to. And the big task for next time is starting to work on enemy AI to properly turn this into a game. If I have time, I'll also start doing some experiments with UI Toolkit to try and make grids with similar functionality to what we already have. It won't be a full rework of the inventory system quite yet, but it's starting to lay the groundwork to move in that direction. As always, I appreciate you guys watching, and I'm happy the previous video did as well as it did. You guys are awesome. If you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to do so to stay up to date on the project, and keep an eye out for any other tutorials I put out. Also, dropping a like and a comment down below helps a ton. Hasta luego!
Please listen carefully.